Hey everyone, my name's Olivia. Welcome to our United Online. Today, Pastor Lucas is going to be preaching on a series titled Legendary. Enjoy the message.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another week of United Online. I am so excited to kick off a brand new message series called Legendary, where we're talking about heroes of faith and how their story applies to our life in today's context. And today, we're going to kick it off with the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 41. Now, what's interesting is this is not the beginning of Joseph's story. It's not the end of his life, but I want to share with you a principle that I believe is going to encourage each and every one of us. So I'm going to start in Genesis chapter 41 and verse 37, and let me give you a little context of what is happening when we pick up this story. Pharaoh is the king of Egypt, and he has just had a dream that no one can interpret. None of his soothsayers, none of his priests, no one can interpret the dream that Pharaoh has. And Pharaoh believes that this dream speaks to the future of the nation of Egypt. And so Joseph was a slave in Egypt, right? And he gets brought before Pharaoh to interpret the dream of Pharaoh. And this is where we pick it up in verse 37. All right? It says, Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. And so Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? So Joseph gives an accurate interpretation to Pharaoh's dream, and then Pharaoh hears it and says, can we find anyone else like this guy, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Now, Pharaoh is a godless king. He doesn't serve the Jehovah God, but he recognizes that Joseph has the Spirit of the living God on the inside of him. Verse 39 says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dream to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. And then Pharaoh says, only I sitting on my throne will have a rank higher than yours. So here's what I want you to know. Here's what I want you to understand. Pharaoh recognized Joseph, that he had the Spirit of God living on the inside of him. Joseph gave an accurate interpretation to Pharaoh's dream and then gave him wise counsel what to do with the interpretation. And so Pharaoh makes him the number 2 ruler in all the land of Egypt. And here's what I want you to know, that God's Spirit in you will take you places that you cannot take yourself. So Joseph finds himself standing before Pharaoh. Joseph finds himself standing before the king. He was just in prison. Now he finds himself standing before the king. And because the Spirit of God is on the inside of him, the Spirit of God lifts him places that he could not take, that he could not go on his own. So God's Spirit in you will take you places that you could not take yourself. So in this season and in this time where we're shut in, where we're quarantining, where we're doing all these things, let me encourage you to strengthen the Spirit of God on the inside of you, so that when you stand before pharaohs, when you stand before kings, when you stand before your teachers, when you stand before your friends, they can see the Spirit of God on the inside of you. And when they see the Spirit of God on the inside of you, it will take you places. Or in other words, it will give you influence into other people's lives that you couldn't have on your own. But here's my question for you. How did Pharaoh get to the place from prison to stand before the king? So I want to kind of peel this story backwards, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So in the beginning of chapter 41, in verses 9 and 10, Pharaoh, his chief cupbearer, right, realizes that Pharaoh's having all this trouble with people interpreting his dreams. And his chief cupbearer remembers that when he was in prison, there was this guy named Joseph who could interpret dreams. And this is what he says in verse 9. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up and said, today I've been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. And then verse 10, here's what it says. Some time ago. Some time ago. Well, exactly how long is some time ago? So what happened was Pharaoh was having a bad day. You know, we all have bad days. He was mad at his chief cupbearer. He was mad at his chief baker, and he throws him in prison some time ago. And while they're in prison, they both have a dream. The chief cupbearer has this dream, and the baker has a dream. And Joseph is in prison with these two at the same time. And he gives an accurate interpretation to the cupbearer's dream and the baker's dream, right? And the cupbearer is restored to his place of prominence, and the baker was executed for his service, right? So he gives an accurate interpretation of these two guys' dreams. Now the chief cupbearer sees Pharaoh, and none of his people can interpret his dreams, and he's like, you know what? I think I know a guy. I think I remember a guy. Some time ago, Pharaoh, you were kind of upset with me. Well, exactly how long is some time ago? Well, let's go back a little bit further. In verse 1, it says 2 years later. So 2 years after Joseph gives an accurate interpretation to the chief cupbearer and to the chief baker, 2 years later is when Pharaoh is having these dreams. It says 2 years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. So 2 years ago, Joseph gives an accurate interpretation to this guy's dream. And he's got to wait in prison for 2 years, 2 entire years in isolation and confinement, all by himself before he finds himself standing in the place before the king, before the Pharaoh of Egypt, where he can interpret his dream. Let me ask you a question. Don't you think that Joseph would have been bitter? Don't you think that Joseph would have been frustrated? Don't you think that Joseph could have had bad days while he was in the prison all by himself, knowing that he gave an accurate interpretation, that the chief cupbearer is back in his place of prominence and Joseph is all alone in a dungeon all by himself? Don't you think that he could have turned bitter and he could have just felt sorry for himself and been frustrated? Don't you think all those things could happen? And I bet you Joseph had bad days. I bet you Joseph was frustrated about his situation. I bet you those things happened. But here's what's interesting. It said that 2 years, it was 2 years, but when he stood before Pharaoh, Pharaoh could recognize the Spirit of God on the inside of him. So I'm not telling you don't have a bad day. I'm not telling you you can't have emotions. I'm not telling you you can't do those things. But what I am telling you is that they can't ruin who you are in Christ. Don't let them, let me say it like this, don't let them soil your spirit. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh, man, Pharaoh could see the Spirit of God on the inside of him. I'm sure he had bad days. Right? I'm sure he had bad days, but he didn't let those bad days ruin the Spirit of God that was on the inside of him. And don't let these bad days, don't let this isolation, don't let what we're going through right now ruin the Spirit of God that is on the inside of you, so that when you stand before kings and when you stand before people, they can recognize the Spirit of God. This is a time for us to strengthen our spirit. So I want to encourage you wherever you're at and whatever you're watching, because listen to me. Okay, I want to say something that's a little strong, but I think it's going to be good medicine. Okay, Joseph could have felt like a victim. He could have felt like a victim of his circumstances. All right, he was sold into slavery. His brothers didn't want him. He served in Potiphar's house. All this stuff was gone. He could have become a victim of his circumstance. But here's what I want you to do. All right, listen to me. I'm telling you because I love you. I want you to fight against a victim mentality. I want you to fight against a victim mentality. What do I mean by that? You start feeling, it's like the world you become self-centered. The world, you don't see what's going on at large. All you can do is focus on you, and you sit and you sour and you stir and you become negative. Here's a couple things that you got to fight in the season that we're in. It's this idea that bad things are happening and are going to keep happening. That things are worse and are only going to get worse from here. That's a victim mentality. That other people or other circumstances are to blame. That you are where you are and and you don't take responsibility. You blame other people. You blame what's going on in the world today. You blame that you can't be at school. Right? You got to fight against letting that victim mentality come on you, because I'm sure Joseph could have felt that way. You feel like there's no point to try, right? You have this feeling of, well, I just want to give up. I don't want to keep going. I don't want to move on. And then really, here's the big one. Here's the big one, y'all. It's negative self-talk and it's self-sabotage. Where you have these negative thoughts and you just repeat them over and over and over. And you self-sabotage yourself. All of these things, you got to fight against having a victim mentality in this season. Letting the circumstances dictate who you're going to be and what you're going to do. Listen to me. Fight against a victim mentality. And here's what I want you to understand. Where does this victim mentality coming from? How does it surface in people's lives? Really? I believe it surfaces when people let down their guard and give it an opportunity to just come forward. All that it needs is an excuse. A victim mentality is just looking for an excuse to surface. And we are in a season where it has an excuse to surface. And what do I mean by that? It has an excuse. You're all alone. You're by yourself. We're in quarantine. There's got this corona thing going on. We don't know how long it's going to last or when life is going to be back to normal. And what we can do is we can let down our guard. We can throw our faith by the wayside. We can become lax in our faith. All of those things. And then what happens is that victim mentality, that woe is me, it's not my fault, and there's nothing I can do, begins to surface, and then you become, you take on that victim mentality. Listen to me, I'm encouraging you. We're talking about the life of Joseph, because when he stood before the king, Pharaoh recognized the Spirit of God on the inside of him. And I'm telling you, right? I'm telling you, even though he could have become a victim of his circumstances, the Spirit of God was bigger in him than his circumstances, and that is what I'm encouraging you with today. I want to close with this, okay? Fight the temptation to become self-centered, where the world revolves around you, and it's all about you. You got to stay Christ-centered. Stay Christ-centered, strong in spirit. All right? Stay Christ-centered. And then number 3, you got to become solution-centered. How can you do? What can you do in this season? What can you do in this time? Listen, in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12, Jesus says, "Do unto others what you would like them to do unto you." This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and the prophets. So fight the temptation to become self-centered. Stay Christ-centered and become solution-centered. Do unto others what you would like them to do unto you. So I want to leave you with a practical challenge. What can you do for somebody that you wish would be done for you in this time? I'm going to ask you to just ask the Holy Spirit what He is speaking to you through this message. Hear it, and then do for somebody what you wish would be done to you. Fight the temptation to become self-centered. Stay Christ-centered. Become solution-centered. Listen, I love you. I'm praying for you, and I miss you like crazy. And we'll see you real soon.
We hope you enjoyed today's message. If it really encouraged you, we would love for you to share it with a friend. Make sure to stay connected, follow us on Instagram, and we'll see you next week.